title, which is Not Caring for Truth, but Only for Righteousness, Jesuit Proselytization in Early Modern Japan. Thank you.
First of all, thank you very much for your presence, in spite of being Sunday morning before lunch. And especially I would like to express my cordial gratitude to Hiro-san and Ken-san for giving me this to participate in this very informative international conference. So let us start by the introduction. The main body of my presentation is divided in three parts, as you can see on the screen. So let us start with introduction. Generally speaking, there are some methods for researching Jesuit proselytization in early modern Japan. The first is, of course, the historical method, which searches for direct references in documents such as the reports and letters of Jesuits who actually proselytized in Japan. The second method is the philological approach, which seeks to elucidate the characteristics of the books that the Jesuits created to explain their teachings to Japanese people. In my research, I exclusively use this second approach. As I have repeatedly stated in my previous article, these doctrinal texts are translations from works in Spanish, Latin, or Portuguese, or even Italian. The proselytization method and policies of Jesuits become clear when we observe the differences between these translations and the original text. The problem with this approach is that there are few documents that can be compared with the original text. However, in the past 20 years, at least 2 new documents in this area have been discovered. I touched upon these 2 texts in my chapter, in my book chapter of the Chi no Microcosmos, the microcosmos of knowledge, published in this March, edited by Hiro-san and Ozawa-san. Thank you very much. And which was these 2 texts share a certain characteristic in common. During the process of translation, the idea of the soul and its immortality was added, and the conclusion was made that there's reward and punishment in the next life. In other words, these texts claimed that, in contrast to present life, in which good people live in poverty and bad people are praised, the souls of individual people are immortal, and that God brings justice in the next life. I argue that this ethical theory of the soul is one of the key points of the conversion policy of the Society of Jesus. However, we should consider whether the connection between the immortality of the soul and the punishment and reward in the next life was really a unique invention of this Jesuit in Japan. In this presentation, I would like to show that this way of thinking already existed in Europe at that time. I would also like to empirically demonstrate that this conception is mentioned in a European dangerous text of the Renaissance period, which had the ability to destroy the tense relationship between philosophy and theology, and that the Jesuits had known this when they used this argument to explain the immortality of the soul in areas where they proselytized. By documenting these things, I hope to bring your attention to the flexibility of the conversion measures of the Jesuits. as well as the intellectual context of its members. First, I would like to summarize my 2014 article as a basis of this presentation. The Compendium Catholicae Veritatis, the book, as you can see on the upper right on the screen, the Compendium Catholicae Veritatis is a three-part astronomy, philosophy, and theology work, which was written for use as a textbook at the Jesuit Collegium. There are extant manuscripts of the Latin and Japanese versions. The second section of the book, which is on philosophy, is an outline of the third book of Aristotle's De Anima. The Japanese version was discovered in 1997. The term in the second section that reflects the privileged position assigned to Aristotle by the Society of Jesus at that time. Quote, Aristotle, the philosopher without any equal under heaven. In Japanese, Tenka Musou no Philosopho Aristotle, has recently become famous among Japanese scholarships. Another relevant document, Symbol de Fe, is a 1611 Kilistanban book that was discovered in 2009 in Harvard University. It is a Japanese translation of the first section of Luis de Granada's Introducción de la Símbolo de la Fe, published in 1583 in Salamanca, Spain. These two books share a certain tendency. In other words, as I mentioned in the introduction, a difficult to understand philosophical explanation of the intellective or rational soul was added during translation. And this theory of the soul is used to lead to the conclusion that the soul is immortal. In short, the added content contains a philosophical explanation of the intellective soul, which is greatly described as the main soul of humans, that makes humans the lords of creation, Banbutsu no Reichō in Japanese, describing the excellence and non-materiality of the intellective soul, which contains the intellect that is unique to humans. These texts discuss the immortality of the soul. Since I have reviewed this in more detail in my previous article, and it does not directly relate to my today's presentation, so I would like to move forward. The discussion then turns to the reason. Sorry, I should have moved on this. Sorry, I should have showed this before. This discussion then turns to the reason that the soul is immortal, with the text stating the following. I read. The virtue of justice is characterized by the reward of the good and the punishment of the wicked. And so theirs is by no means unsparing when it comes to rewarding and punishing. However, when we look around the world today, it seems that few good people are rewarded and few wicked people are punished. And this can be a cause for doubt. It's a virtue of justice not present in theirs? In conclusion, this is evidence for the existence of an immortal animal. If there is to be full virtue of justice, then all punishment and rewards must ultimately be meted out. If not in this world, then in the next. If punishment and reward are to be received in the next world, then it follows that humans must have an immortal animal. Thus, if you know those, then the immortal existence of the animal will be self-evident. The reason why soul is immortal is that it must exist as the subject of punishment and reward in the next life. the next world exists as a place that resolves the contradiction of the present world. This is how the added section on the immortality soul concludes. This reasoning is also found in the Compendium Catholicae Veritatis. But because of the time, I have to skip, and I cannot read this fragment. Father Kawamura, who researches on this Compendium Catholicae Veritatis from a Japanese intellectual history perspective, explains the reason why this content was added. He highlights the difference between the native religion of true Pure Land Buddhism, Ikkoshu or Jodo Shinshu, and Catholic doctrine. In these two religions, there is a difference in interpretation as to whether human religious salvation depends on self-power, jiriki, or other power, tariki. Father Kawamura points out that this is a very point that at which Catholicism appealed to Japanese people at that time. In other words, in the so-called belief in absolute other power, Zettai Tariki Shinko in Pure Land Buddhism, it is hard to inspire ethical awareness and the aspiration to live a better life. So, missionaries attempted to encourage ethical aspirations for Japanese people by using the Christian doctrines of the idea of reward and punishment, which connects this life and the next life, and the notion of the immortality of the soul as the subject that receives this recompense and retribution. The Society of Jesus is known for the detailed observation of the situation and even human psychology in the societies in which they worked. As you may know, the fruit of this operation and research still exist in the form of dictionaries that recorded the language of the areas which they worked. Since the Society of Jesus sought method that accommodated the lifestyles of local people, Father Kawamura's conclusion that this way of explaining the immortality of the soul was primarily devised by coming into contact with the local culture of Japan is very convincing. However, did the method of explaining the immortality of the soul using reward and punishment in the next life as an aid really arise as a result of Jesuits adapting their teachings to Japan and Japanese people? In other words, was it actually an invention of the Jesuits in Japan? I'm asking this because the immortality of the soul and the pros and cons of trying to defend this idea based on the ethical necessity were already being existed in Europe and debated in Europe at that time. So today, I would like to focus on one participant in that debate, Pietro Pomponazzi. Pietro Pomponazzi enrolled at the University of Padua in 1486. But about him, Professor Nejime informed us of many things, so I try not to be redundant. He studied Aristotle's philosophy using philological techniques. At the time, due to the influence of humanism, there were constant efforts to find errors and find appropriate translations of Aristotle. Through this effort, Pomponazzi arrived at the conclusion that the immortality of the soul cannot be proven by an Aristotelian approach. This conclusion clearly contradicts the Christian teachings. Therefore, when Pomponazzi's seminal work, titled On the Immortality of the Soul, was published in 1516, it was met with a barrage of criticisms, and the author was suspected of heresy. However, in the same book, Pomponazzi states that while the immortality of the soul might not be the truth, it can nevertheless be considered a teaching that is conducive to social justice. He makes this claim in chapter 14, arguing that it is appropriate to sacrifice truth for common social good. In other words, giving precedence to ethical aims over logical investigations. I read. As Plato and Aristotle say, the statesman is a physician of souls, and the purpose of the statesman is to make man righteous rather than learned. Now, according to the diversity of men, one must proceed by different devices to attain this end. The device that Pomponazzi presents here should make humans realize that there is no contradiction between the severe reality of this life and God's justice in the world. He continues as follows. Therefore, they have set up for the virtuous eternal reward in another life, and for the vicious eternal punishment, which frighten greatly, and the greater part of men, if they do good, do it more from fear of eternal punishment than from hope of eternal good. Since punishments are better known to us than that eternal good, the lawgiver, regarding the prowess of man to evil, intending the common good, has decreed that the soul is immortal, not caring for truth, but only for righteousness. In the original text, it reads, non curas de veritate, sed tantum de probitas. He also states the following, but because of time, let me skip this. But I would like you to pay attention to the word fiction. Here, he clearly states that the immortality of the soul is fictions, in apology in Latin, that leads all humans to the way of morality, despite having no theoretical basis. In other places, he also used the word figumenta, in inventions in English, in the same context. Pomponazzi wants to say that the immortality of the soul is not truth but valid as a justice, that it is not correct as natural philosophy, but that it is valid as humanism. One could also say that while it is not truth, it becomes reality by human living it. On the other hand, after Pomponazzi's assertion that the soul is mortal appeared, theologians were for the first time forced to prove the correctness of Christian doctrine in the same way that Pomponazzi did. The Jesuit of the Coimbra school led the charge to do so. They declared this attitude through their creation of commentaries on Aristotle's various works. According to the research on Emily Michel, the philosophical discussion rejecting Pomponazzi's assertion continued until the mid-17th century. Therefore, we can see that the Jesuit came to Japan possessing this European intellectual background. In response to this declaration, some of you may ask that, how do you know that the Jesuit who came to Japan had read Pomponazzi's work? Isn't this just a similarity or coincidence? This is just a circumstantial proof that is often found in intellectual history research. In response to such questions, I would like to present an example from the added chapter of Simbolo da Fé, which states that they must have read Pomponazzi's work. I introduced this passage in my latest article. There, I matched the statement underlined here. A man named it the horizon between the temporal and the eternal, with the famous statement of Marsilio Ficino, the boundary between eternal and temporal. I also wrote that the second underlined phrase, Además declared it is a link between the nature of the corporal and the spiritual, must be a reference to Pomponazzi. And the reason why the editors of Simbolo da Fé maintains Pomponazzi's anonymity, describing him as a man, is probably because the church saw him as heretical, and so the editor of the passage avoided giving his name. Well, as far as I know, this is the only documentary proof that some works of Neoplatonists were known to Japan, and I acknowledge that I need more documentary proofs. Maybe it will be my next focus, the focus of my next study. This presentation has three main conclusions. First, while criticisms of Pomponazzi being repeated in Europe, the Jesuits in Japan calculatingly decided to explain the immortality of the soul using his ethical and humanistic method. When the Jesuits came into contact with Japanese people, they naturally thought of Pomponazzi's humanistic theory of the soul, concluding that it was effective as a means for converting people. Next, the Jesuit flexibly used Pomponazzi's claim that the immortality of the soul is not the truth but reality, which can also be seen as a double truth or skillful switch from a demonstrative argument to a probable argument. In closing, as the third conclusion, I would like to make the following overall claim by putting this fact back into the historical context of Japanese Kirishitan history. The reality that Japanese believers became martyrs one after another based on their belief in the immortality of the soul and their hope in the next life was ideal material for asserting the justifiability of this probable argument back in Europe. This enables us to understand the hidden reason why Jesuits repeatedly mention in their reports to Rome that Japanese people show a particular interest in the immortality of the soul. That is all I have to say.